the store select, because you're passing in a string, you don't get the type inference of what's being returned, correct? I mean, you would now have to type that because,
Well,
It's an observable.
so I'm typing
well,
it
it's
here.
an observable, but it's an observable of what? Because,
So I'm typing it up here. So I'm saying this is an observable. So items.
correct, you have to type it yourself. You don't
Yeah.
get any type inference from store.select because
Correct.
you're passing a string in.
As far as I know, that is correct.
Okay.
And so that's the piece where you kind of have to make that mental note of like, okay, I know that. So one is if you do store.select, you're always going to get an observable. And so then you just have to simply say, well, what is this? And that's where you would kind of get it from the reducers. What does this reducer return? And I mean, that's it. So store.select, store.subscribe. And I found this part to be pretty straightforward. I think where really kind of the mind bend happened for me is back up in the reducers of one, making immutable operations, and starting to think of, I'm doing something down here. So for instance, I'm editing or I'm updating, like let's say an item. It's happening here, but it doesn't really truly happen until it gets up to here. And so I think that just to take 1 second and go back to Gerard Sand's excellent graphic, as I think this is just a really good representation of what's happening. Is you have your view that's dispatching an object that goes into or dispatches an action, which then goes into your reducer, that then returns state, which then gets fed back down to your view. And so, whereas I kind of have like kind of everything a little bit shifted, this is a pretty good way to do this. And so I will probably actually start describing it this way, because to me it makes a lot of sense. Something happens in the view, you dispatch an action object, and then it just flows action, reducer, store, back down to your view. And so it literally just kind of falls down and goes right back into your view. The difference is that occasionally you need to do something asynchronous, and so where you are dispatching an action, that would go into a service, something may happen, and then, or rather an event that then goes into the service that then actually dispatches an action object, or in case of like doing computed observables, something comes out of the store, or a couple things that you can put a service in between your store and your view, and then combine them together as well. But it's kind of this loop. Like that was really fairly easy for me to get, but now it comes into these kind of practical questions of like, what happens if I need to actually call a remote server? Like, what do you do? And that is where the service sits in front of your actions object before that gets done. Or what if you have more than one thing that you need to combine? So let's say you have a user object, like selected user, that has items. So they have, let's say, an items property with some IDs, and then you want to get the items store and say, go get me all of the items with this ID and push this in here. And so I can actually show you a plunk of that when we get to kind of that final module. But that was something that actually Jules Kremer and I probably spent like an entire day trying to wrap our mind around. And then Rob was just like, oh, well, that's just observable, combine latest. And then the stars, the moon, everything aligned, and I was reborn like a phoenix from the ashes.
For me, I've been thinking of store as a database with all of the baggage that carries. But just looking at the source code for it, it's only like 7 files and a few hundred lines. There's not a lot to it. It's not like super complicated underneath.
So that's one thing that I do want to iterate is that Redux is really, really simple. So please, when we're done with this, go watch those videos that Dan Abramoff did. And I think, as Joel Hooks calls it, his documentation is read by the author is pretty fascinating, is when you see how he puts this together and his kind of thought process behind it, within 2 hours, it's really clear the intent and how this thing comes together. But it's not very complicated. I think NGRX store is like 70 lines of code or something. Like it's really not doing a lot. And so in this case, unlike Angular 1.x directive source code, which if you want to go into a Bermuda Triangle, that's what that is. But in this case, pull down the source code and look through it. And I think it might even make sense to try to actually rewrite it, just to really get a sense of it. Ben Lesh just did a really good article on Medium the other day about how to create an observable from scratch. So observables actually are not that complicated either. They just invert the entire data flow. But I think really to understand something, to be able to do it by yourself, by hand, then you can appreciate it and you understand the nuances when it's time to implement it. Yes?
Why not just use Redux? What is it NGRX gives you that's Angular specific?
Observables.
Okay, the Redux doesn't use observables. Okay.
And that's it. So now you no longer have to say, this thing happened, I need to basically pull it out and pull it from the stores. With this, it just flows down right into your view, which I think is phenomenal. I mean, it just cuts that boilerplate right down. All right, so before I issue the challenges, do we have any questions in the chat room?
There was one from a while ago. They're just asking if NGRX works well with Falcor or any good way to use GraphQL with Angular 2.
Oh, Falcor. So I don't feel qualified to answer that question, honestly. In theory, I really like Falcor. I tried to put together a proof of concept. I was able to get it working in the client side within 5 minutes. I ran into some real problems on the server side, trying to actually set that up, because whereas I tend to think of everything as kind of a RESTful API, that completely goes away from that. And then I was talking to Paul Taylor about it, and there was some issues with some like RxJS versioning and some differences between the repo and the NPM package, and so it just kind of fell apart for me. Scott, if you've done anything with Falcor, I'd love to hear it. But I mean, Falcor also is built on observables, and so you may not even need NGRX in that case.
Yeah, definitely. So Falcor's in dev preview. I've worked on Falcor with the Angular 2 library integration, so I've been using it for a while. It's in dev preview. It definitely doesn't work well with the way Redux is built right now, so I wouldn't really want to use the two together. But if you were to use Falcor or something like GraphQL, you could just tie right into the async pipes, which I think is awesome. In fact, they had a demo of that quite a while ago of how that was set up. But honestly, I think it's just a lot of overhead to use like all these tools. I mean, you already have observables, you're using NGRX, now you're going to tie in something like Falcor, GraphQL. It seems a bit much. Falcor, once it's ready, it's not as challenging to set up as GraphQL is, because GraphQL, again, it's like a completely different query language, and it only works for like Node right now, whereas Falcor is a little more available in other places. So GraphQL, they're all pretty cool. Relay, that's pretty awesome. But I think this is like the NGRX or the Redux patterns is like a really nice skin on top of something without having to jump gun and make a big investment on a server change or something like that. That's something you can implement super easily.
And I really just see NGRX as just, well, it's Redux, it's just a pattern with observables, just kind of wrapped around observables in RxJS, which is really kind of on its own is really fairly straightforward and very powerful. So that's where that learning curve comes in. Is like, oh, there has to be an JS like operator for this thing I want to do, and I can never remember it. And so learning the documentation. With that said, let's get into some challenges.
I just wanted to make one comment about my perspective on Falcor and GraphQL is just like...
Get ready for some scathing rhetoric.
No, I mean, pretty much it's just like, if you need to batch requests, like if you're making a ton of AJAX requests and you want to like batch them up, I think that's like the big use case, right? Yes. And like hydrating, like state in your local cache or whatever. But not everybody has that need, right?
So it was created in the bowels of Netflix, so you can imagine that they have the money, the resources, and the traffic to necessitate that. So I don't think it's definitely a candidate for a minimum viable product. That there's a certain threshold in which that becomes relevant, and you better get out your checkbook. Figuratively speaking. because it's open source for the most part.